welcome back to everyone who was here on Wednesday already, and welcome to anyone who is joining only this session. So my name is Christian Spielmann. I'm together with Ralph Becker, kind of running the session today. We're both kind of working on the training aspect for the economics network. I'm in Bristol, Bristol University, and I quickly ask Ralph to say hi as well and introduce himself.
Hello, thank you, Christian. I'm from the University of Manchester.
Excellent. So this is the second of our symposium sessions. And the focus is very much on assessment and thinking about how we can bring some of the assessment practices which we have trialed over the last year forward into the future and preserve those. So Wednesday's session, the focus was very much on blended learning. How have we adapted learning, and what are really the positive aspects and the opportunities of blended learning, which we really want to make sure we can preserve and we can build on going forward. So assessment, obviously a really big part of what we are doing at university. So having a whole session on assessment was something we thought is appropriate to really think what are the opportunities here going forward. We were thinking before the session, it was quite an incredible year in terms of how much flexibility some of us might have had in changing the things we could never change or never easily change within the higher education content text. And I think many have noticed that, or have used this opportunity to trial new ways of assessment. And obviously some of it maybe hasn't worked so well, and we really hope for some of it coming back as it was before the pandemic, but I think some really creative things have emerged as well, and we really should make sure that we can capture those. So before we get started, the plan for today is we asked you before this session about how have you changed assessment, what would you like to keep? So we want to just report a little bit on your comments. After that, we go into our plenary presentations. We have 4 presentations from colleagues who just want to share what they think has worked really well and what is worth preserving going forward. And then we want you to engage and discuss and contribute and think about assessment in some interactive parallel sessions. And for that, I would just like you to choose one of our 4 topics, and Ashley might be able to share the 4 topics. And what we'll ask you is to rename yourself so that the number of the room you would like to join is just in front of your name. So rename your name in Zoom to 1, 2, 3, 4, and then your name. And the first session will be on program-wide assessment, a discussion group. And the second one will be online MCQs. What are the possibilities? We've all used them, or many of us have used them more heavily than in the past. Is there a limit to how much we can use them? So number 3 is really a thesis to discuss. There is no cheating, it's all collaboration. But I think many and probably all of us have experienced problem of collusion. And so this is a session about discussing how can we, what can we do? How do we have to redesign assessment to respond to that? And then the 4th one is around assessing large numbers of students and how to give them feedback. And so that are the 4 rooms. So I'm just checking So the rename session, renaming doesn't work. Okay. So it that's a shame. It did work on Wednesday, so Zoom must have changed something. My suggestion is, Ashley, can you see what is happening here? My suggestion would be, okay, we'll bring up
okay. Can you check now?
Later. Okay.
Check now.
Let's do it again. So some people can rename. Works now. Perfect. Yes, it works. Okay. So we'll give you a bit of time to rename your name and just indicate which breakout group you would like to join later on. But I'll come back to those breakout groups if you haven't managed to get the number in front of
Perhaps, Christian, can I add at this stage, because Sahira quite rightly pointed out that this is a really tough choice, as they're all interesting. We will end these sessions with a short summary from the group leaders of every group, and the sort of summaries and potential resources where necessary will also be linked on the website afterwards. So then you'll not be missing the essentials from the other groups either.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that. Great. Okay. So we wanted to start with thinking a bit about the big changes which have been introduced throughout this year, often in a very quick way, and maybe we hadn't really had the chance to think about how we would actually design assessment for this year. And we asked you what you have changed, right, Ralph? And
yes.
So we just wanted to summarize your thoughts there. How has assessment changed, Ralph?
So I think the big theme is less exam-based assessments, and that means more sort of coursework type. Even if they were called, and we had that in a discussion before we started, even if they're still called exams, but in some sense, if you have a 48 hours or even 7-day open book exam, really you should be thinking about this as being a piece of coursework. And lots of colleagues reported that. More presentations, vivas, discussion board contributions, but also a very clear change in the type of questions that have been asked, i.e. questions which are much more open-ended, questions which you can't just answer by looking at your lecture notes or slides. And I think colleagues have realized that you couldn't ask that in the world of open books. And sort of, we also asked you not only what has changed, but what do you want to keep? And the very clear agreement here is we want to do less exam-based, more open book exams / courseworks, perhaps even more group assessments, and perhaps also where that is useful, more computer-aided assessment. That seem to be the themes coming through.
Yeah, I think it's linked to some opportunities which have been discussed much more widely about, like, how do we make assessment more authentic, and that's obviously something we have been talking about before COVID as well. So how can we create assessment which directly links to the work realities and the life realities of our students. And I think the last year maybe has asked us again to, or forced to think about coming up with assessment methods which have the potential to be much more authentic, even if that wasn't the main reason why we have changed towards them. I think there's also a big aspect about making assessment inclusive, and there might be a bit of a question whether some of our online assessment has increased that or decreased inclusivity. I mean, timed online exams, I think, have been challenging for many of us, but coursework as a more flexible mode of assessing has maybe increased inclusivity. And I think the last opportunity which we might be able to harvest in these new forms of assessment is to really ask ourselves, where can we use technology also for us to improve our work and to lessen some of the assessment load, and still at the same time give students appropriate feedback. And I think that's a question which will be with us going forward. We have asked you about the challenges and where you feel we need to think more, we need to talk more to actually harvest the best of the new assessment into the future, right, Ralph? So what came up there in terms of challenges
Yes.
you have identified?
Absolutely. So your answer to the question, what do you need help with in this arena? And Christian, what you already mentioned, inclusivity was one of the issues. But you're also asking for how I need ideas for creative assessment ideas, and how do I ask questions that are suitable for this new sort of open book environment. But also the theme that came through is how can we assess learning when we have to assess like in an unsupervised environment? And in other words, I think that's the elephant in the room. How do we deal with cheating? And we will have one of the parallel sessions that talks about that. I don't think we'll possibly have super great solutions here, but perhaps can make you a bit more relaxed about some things. And then, of course, there's also the issue about online assessments. Where do they have a role, and how can we use them? And we'll try and talk about that a bit as well.
Yeah, so we hope that our presentation and the breakout rooms will respond to that a little bit, and we will also have a bit of a panel discussion at the very end. I think that there's one more thing which is more worth mentioning. On Wednesday, we talked about this new blended learning system, which actually has many more elements. We as instructors are designing a much larger part of the learning journey from the student. We're thinking about asynchronous material. We're thinking about a little test there. We think about the live lecture, the smaller group session, and when all this happens. So there's much more we are designing and thinking about in this new blended world. And we have always been talking a lot about aligning assessment to teaching practice. And I think what has happened with this more complex system, that this alignment is also more challenging, because in a way, I think we have to think about how do we align all these different aspects, the asynchronous material, with how I assess the students, the live session, how I assess the students, the independent learning, how does that all come together? So I think that's a challenge we are all facing, but we do know that this alignment is really important to make sure students are incentivized and see the reason why they are engaging with the different learning activities. Ralph.
If I can just chip in there, in some sense, this alignment has become a little more easy, because if you think of the previous world where we had sit-down exams, that was really the only thing in your unit you did in that way, where you set students by themselves on the table, with no other material. And in some sense, aligning that to what you did before was actually really challenging. Now that we often can't assess in that way anymore, I mean, so you have to assess in sort of environments which much more look like the environment students encounter throughout the rest of the year, i.e. being able to research, being able to read. And so in some sense, this alignment problem has actually become easier. It's just that previously we didn't think so much about it.
Great, thanks, Ralph. And on that comment, I think we should dive into our good practice examples. So we have 4 presentations, just thinking about something which has worked really well and on what we can build going forward in the new world. And I think Ralph starts these sessions.
The context is a second-year quantitative methods econometrics class I teach together with my colleague Martin Andrews, sort of focused on causal inference, applied methods, lots of thinking about examples, and also our practical training. And what we want to do with this assessment is we want to test how students can interpret empirical work, identify the strategies, assumptions made in the work, and can identify strengths and weaknesses. And here, this is how we align assessment with the actual learning outcomes. We're actually having 5. So let me not first talk about the assessment, but first what we do throughout the course. We're having 5, you can call them tutorials or practicals or demo classes. And in each of these classes throughout the term, we do the same thing. We're giving students a paper to read, an empirical paper to read. So some paper on the left. And then we're giving them questions to think about that paper and to analyze what do the authors do, what are the strengths and the weaknesses for the paper, how do they try to identify any causal impacts. And then there will also be some methodological questions, also traditional style tutorial questions. And we do this 5 times throughout the term. Okay, next slide now, Ashley, please. Ashley, can I have the next slide? Excellent, here. So then what do we do in the exam? And let's first think about if it's an online assessment. Well, we do basically exactly the same thing. We're giving students several weeks before the exam, we're giving them a paper to read, and we're telling them, well, in the exam, you will be asked some questions on that paper. And then when the exam is released, then they will get the exact questions we will be answering. So they may have to comment on the source of the data, the particular identification scheme, and strengths and weaknesses here. And in our case, that was a 48-hour exam. And since we have this structure very much aligned to the demonstration classes, we make a really big point out of saying that these tutorials or demonstration classes, they're really like 5 practice exams for the students, because they always have sort of the same structure. Now, actually, we had this structure already before COVID. So next slide, please, Ashley. So how would that work? If you're still having on-campus sit-down exams, well, it would not be a closed book exam. The structure is basically exactly the same, with the one difference that we are asking students or telling students you can bring into exam a cheat sheet. All right, so read that paper. Again, they get it way before. Read that paper, write down what's important, how did I do things. We're telling you, you can bring in a cheat sheet, one A4 sheet, handwritten, not photocopied, with all your thoughts on this paper. And then in the exam, you get the actual questions to which you have to answer. There'll also be some methodological questions, but all, for instance, graphs and tables, which are relevant, would be replicated in the exam paper. So the structure doesn't really change a lot, even if you want to make use of the very nice feature of sit-down exams is that you can authenticate who the student is and that the student basically works alone, but the same structure can be maintained. Next slide, please. So if you do this sort of stuff, what are the takeaway tips? I've boiled it down to 3. Firstly, align it with what you do in the course. So make tutorials or practicals, mirror the exam structure, and call them frequently practice exams. If you do this empirical, if you have the luxury in your unit to be able to use empirical papers, choose interesting ones, and there are loads about. Then one issue with this is that you still have to find challenging questions that test the top end of the students. If you read your assessment criteria, sort of test over there, some creativity and thinking between students. To these sorts of questions, it's very important that they lead outside of the paper which you give them to read, right? So that needs to, okay, link the results of this paper with this, what you previously read. Or in this year's exam, we had a comment by some politician of whether the track and trace system worked, and the paper we gave them to read was an empirical investigation of the track and trace system work. And it was actually not quite easy to make them mesh together, but we asked them to do that. How do the findings in this paper relate to the statement of this politician, for instance? So you need to lead out of that paper. Otherwise, students will just be very careful in finding the right answers in the paper. That is my
That's
opinion.
great.
So
Excellent.
Looking forward to your questions on the Padlet.
Yeah, so some questions are on the Padlet already, and I'm sure there will be more. So do use the Padlet. And we go straight on second presentation, and that is Robert.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome from sunny Sutton Coldfield. Feel like in the Eurovision Song Contest now. So what I want to talk about is the following. I think one one issue what a lot of us faced was that when we have a takeaway exam or take-home exam, how do we deal with it when we teach a technical subject? So when I talk technical subject, I think more about things like econometrics, quantitative methods, first year statistics, and so on. And yeah, in Aston University, where I'm a teaching fellow, we defined a take-home exam as an exam paper where, let's say, it's released on Monday at 12 o'clock at noon, and you have 24 hours to finish the exam paper. However, it's still a little bit, you have to be careful when we write the exam paper, because in theory, the students should only require 2 hours to complete the exam paper. So basically, yeah, this can take up to 24 hours, but they should be able, if they have prepared, to finish it in 2 hours. And last year, when when our quants team has been told that we have to move our exam papers to an online 24-hour assessment, we were actually quite worried, because what are the problems? We were worried about grade inflation. Oh my God, everyone will exactly, maybe have a big WhatsApp group and they just post each other the results of the technical calculations. And another thing also what we were worried about when we thought about the assessment type, if you just copy paste things from the on campus to an online exam, is it still a valid assessment? Is it still actually testing the skills we want to test of students? Are we really checking, do they understand econometrics? Or is it basically, how good are they at using Google and other sources and so on? And and also we worried, does it really allow still differentiation between good students and weaker students? We want that not everyone gets a 2-1 or first, we want to have a nice distribution ideally, which reflects the skills of the students. Now, what I used, and it worked very well, is that I used something which is called short notes or briefing notes. I stole this idea from my macroeconomics colleague, Dean, and and I think it worked really, really well. So what is the idea about giving short notes to students in a quantitative environment? So when you look at the intended learning outcomes in your model specification, what you will often see, it's not just about calculation. When I check now my university, the intended learning outcomes, you often will find things like showing awareness of limitations of different models, being able to communicate the results and so on. And I think these are things we sometimes forgot to look at when we had on-campus exams. And by using short notes, it actually works quite well that we do not only look at, do students have the knowledge, but also can they apply the knowledge and also communicate the results. And I think this communication element is really, really something that helps, because if students can explain a concept, then you also know that they know it better than if they just do a calculation. So of course, we had another restriction for students. They have to explain the concept without any excessive jargon. So basically, they should explain it that someone who is not a first economics student, second year, still can understand what the concept is about. Now, for example, what I did, I gave students the opportunity to, I gave them some econometric concepts, let's say OLS estimator, residuals, unbiasedness of regression coefficient, and so on. And students have to select 2 out of the 4. Now, and then they have, I gave them a word limit up to 400 words, just to ensure that they don't have just a brain dump, but they just copy and paste everything what they know, but they have to be selective with what they're going to write about. They cannot do everything what they want. Also, they have to choose what is the best method of explaining. They can use maths, they can use diagrams. It's up to them. They have to decide. They cannot do everything. So again, this allows a little bit of differentiation. And what else did I say here? And then thing that also worked in really nicely, I gave students in advance already a list of the concepts I may going to ask. Let's say I give them 8 concepts, and they know out of the 8 concepts, 4 will appear in the exam. So students could already start reading on the different concepts in advance and could practice writing. In seminars and webinars, they could then ask me questions. They could talk to each other. We can give them an environment where they can share and try to explain different concepts to each other. And all of this together, actually, you could then really differentiate between different types of students. So some students only had definitions. There was rather an average grade, but those who went further had provided additional reading and provided so good communication skills, then of course they were then students who got a first in this element. And okay, I think that's what I wanted to say. And yeah, I hope that was helpful, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Robert. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, suggestions, which we can pick up later. So that was very interesting. Great. So we move on, and it's John next.
Hello. Okay. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I have to admit that what I'm going to talk about, I thought about doing before COVID anyway, and it just accelerated my willingness to take the risk and do it. And basically, I was very aware, and it comes back to what we were talking about, that, and I can only speak a little bit from I'm at Aston with Robert, that although these were 24-hour exams, the students had to be able to complete the questions in 2 hours, okay, even if they'd done the prep. And that was a bit of an issue. And I knew straight away that they were going to be very different style of questions from what I do in a traditional exam. And I knew straight away that I'd probably end up asking or expecting them to do less questions, but in more greater depth. And that meant that I was losing some of the breadth of the module intended learning outcomes, or the breadth in this case in intermediate micro, that I might have tested previously in the exam. The other thing that I was a little bit aware of, and I've always been aware of, is that assessments, they tend to sort of just, unless you have continuous assessment, the students will just cram at the assessment point, okay? And that isn't going to develop, you know, deeper learning. It's going to be crushed into short periods if you've only got 1 or 2 assessment points. So I wanted to try and get a more even distribution of study over the module. Okay, so we know, you know, what do you want an assessment design to do? You want it to signal that the students have to do the right amount of work. In an ideal world, that work will be evenly distributed, and ideally that assessment signals quite high quality learning activities and doesn't signal rote learning or memorization. And in my I teach first year and second year micro. First year micro, I've got all these stocks of multiple choice questions, and I can do a sort of continuous online assessment, and it doesn't kill me because the software takes the work out of it. And I can use software to do pooled multiple choice questions, so each student's getting a different question, and it's randomizing the answer. I wanted to be able to do the same thing in the second year, but I don't know if multiple choice is the right assessment instrument. So I decided to try this random sampling approach of problem sheets, and I should start at the outset by telling me everybody told me not to do it. Okay, everybody told me not to do it. So what I basically did was I said, right, I cannot mark. I've got, by the way, background. I've got 350 students on this module. Okay, I cannot mark 5 or 6 problem sheets. You know, I can't get computer automated marking of it. I just don't have the time. So what I decided to do was at even points during the module, the students would have to submit their answers to 4 specified problem sheets. Okay, and they had deadlines and they submitted them online in the normal way. And what I said to the students was that when it was, after they were submitted, I released modular sort of guidance answers and guidelines. At the end of the last deadline, I then randomly, in fact, Robert, my colleague, was my random number generator to prove this was completely objectively done. So I got Robert, who was teaching stats. I said, I need a random number generator with some credibility, and Robert seemed the ideal person to do this. So I randomly picked, and the students knew this, I should say. I randomly picked one of the problem sheets, and I marked that problem sheet, that same problem sheet, across all the students. So they're not going to have different ones marked. And I could manage marking one of them. But the students in an interesting game here, because if I don't know which of the 4 when I'm submitting them, which one is going to be randomly picked at the end and which one's going to be marked. We tried to try and make the difficulty the same as possible, as much as we could across the 4 guided study sheets. The marking was, I only said I would mark, I wouldn't give a very narrow marking. They'd either get 10 out of 10, 7.5 out of 10, 5 out of 10, or 0. They were the only marks they could get, because I had to be able to mark these quickly because I had 350 of them. And to be honest, I wasn't really bothered about it so much as an accurate measuring device. I was using this to incentivize and encourage continuous effort during the module. And again, if there's any questions about it in Padlet, I can respond to them. What I would say is I'm that stupid that I hadn't thought through that if I want students to engage more with module content during the semester, what does that mean? They're going to ask more of me. The great beauty with having an exam at the end is the students tend to leave you alone until a week before the exam, and then they expect your every second attention 24 hours a day in those last 3 or 4 days running into the exam, and they find it completely unreasonable if you're not willing to respond to emails at 2 a.m. Now, this is different, because obviously if they are engaging continually, and I used a discussion forum to do this, it did actually, it sort of worked better than I thought it would, because it placed more demands on me during the module. And that, I hadn't really thought that through. But in some ways, maybe that's a positive thing. Right, that's just a quick overview of what I did. And all I say is it worked better than I thought it would. And a lot of people told me not to do it.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. I have lots of questions myself, which I want to ask, and so we'll come back to all this. That was very good. Okay, so last presentation is Fabio on Vivas.
Here I am. What I've done similarly to John is something that I implemented before. I put some links to resources in the Padlet as well. Actually, I think we have to move slides.
I think you have to move them quite a bit, because that's our ideas from the beginning. And one more.
I think
there we are.
Yeah, we are. Yes. So if you go forward one bit, yeah. So basically, this is something I've done before, and it's coming from my experience of being a student in Italy, where Viva are pretty much used. So I got trained in that way, and it comes from the observation that our students are assessed in a written format quite intensively, and that's the British tradition, but very little in an oral format. And if they do in an oral format, that is a presentation. But a presentation is just a part of what can be a job interview. In a job interview, what you do, you have to sit in front of somebody who's asking you a question, and you have to answer on the spot. So more than in-depth knowledge is about this ability to link concepts, to be creative in your answers. And I think that this assessment method allows you to do precisely that. So there is a matter of developing skills that generally are not developed. There is an employability reason as well. And I will argue that, with all the concerns about plagiarism in an open book world, you can hardly plagiarize a Viva unless you got some really sophisticated device in your ears and people can actually suggest you what are the answers that you have to give. So that's been working quite well. And this year I moved it entirely online, because my module, I teach a history economic thought module, was entirely online. And the process was seamless. So rather than having students in my office, I had the students on Zoom. And I would record their performances, and they will go on the virtual learning environment along with their feedback. So the quality assurance aspect of the assessment was taken care of. So basically, the way I do that is that I book slots with my students, and Vivas take between 15-20 minutes. And you will be surprised how much you are able to discuss. I mean, we speak faster than what we write. Most certainly, I speak very fast, but giving myself 15-20 minutes to discuss with the students and 10 minutes to write some feedback. So basically, I will book myself a 30-minute slot for each of the students I will meet, and the feedback is just prepared right away. Please, if you plan to do that, give yourself time to plan toilet breaks, lunch break, and a cup of tea. Because the first time I've done it, I didn't plan that, and I had a day off from hell. But if you plan yourself these little breaks, this is gonna work. Feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, what is really important is convincing students that you're doing something that is useful for them, and that is not as scary as they might imagine. And another very important thing is actually opening the Viva with some chit chat, talk about the weather, talk about how they're feeling, which other exams are they doing. And in every feedback I received from the students, that was a crucial point, that I broke the ice and they felt at ease, and then they were ready to actually start the conversation. From an assessment point of view, Ashley, if you don't mind to move to the next slide, please. I think that it's very good if you can combine this assessment in a sort of constructively aligned way. So for instance, I have mini Vivas all across my module, and then I have a critical essay where students develop the knowledge. So you develop the skills, you develop the knowledge in an essay, and then there is a master Viva at the end where you put everything together. So the nice thing about this is that, for instance, students have to engage with the essay feedback in the conversation, which on one side, it gives them something they know they're going to be asked about, and on the other side, it actually forces them to engage with the feedback that otherwise they will forget about, which is also quite good. Can we move to the next slide, please? So one of the tools that I use to make sure that I'm consistent, I use two tools. One is a rubric, and the other is this marking crib. So this is mostly for me. I take notes of the question that I ask the students. The first one are coming from the essay. And this is just as we go along, as I told to the students, I just take quick notes about what's happening in the conversation. And that helps me to be very consistent, well, as consistent as I can be across different students. And then, of course, I go a bespoke rubric. That's my last slide, Ashley, please. Where I just agreed with students what are the criteria we are going to assess. And I give very detailed feedback on the basis of this rubric. But of course, this can be changing according to the different types of Viva that I'm running. I strongly argue that, for me, it's going back to the roots and the way I got trained, but it's a very effective method of assessing students and not as time consuming as one might think. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Yeah, I agree. That was very inspirational. Thanks, Sarah. Excellent. So thanks for putting questions on Padlet. Do put more questions on there, and we'll bring that in at the end of the session. First message, we are closing the breakout room soon, but no, you continue chatting because hopefully it was good and inspiring. That's great. So the plan for now is to just ask the facilitators of the 4 interactive sessions to just quickly summarize and share some of the ideas, the main insights they've kind of distilled from the discussion, and share with everyone. So could we start with Alvin? So you were doing the program-wide assessment, reflecting on that. Alvin, do you want to...
Thanks, Christian. So yeah, we had a very nice conversation actually about a whole range of things. For those who don't know, what we're talking about here is sort of assessment across modules or across units or even across years, where you're bringing together knowledge and skills in a more sort of synthetic way. And we talked a lot about some of the difficulties in this. I mean, a lot of the difficulties are around coordination across units and modules, and whether the online world might make that coordination easier because things are recorded. You can, there's a lower fixed cost in actually finding out what other people are doing in concurrent units, for example. But that still means there's a difficulty involved in actually setting assessments which span across units. We talked about the fact that the dissertation in the final year is a bit like a synthetic program level assessment, and perhaps we ought to think about about putting these in the second and first year as well. We had an interesting discussion with a colleague from Warwick, who says they seem to do something like this already, which is pretty encouraging. And the final thing I'll just add is one of the difficulties we talked about briefly was learning outcomes. That, you know, every unit, every module at the moment has learning outcomes, which almost forces you to assess those learning outcomes at an atomistic kind of level within the unit. So we may need to think more broadly. I think there was an agreement amongst most of us that this was a good thing to sort of try and achieve, but learning outcomes almost force you to think at a modular level rather than across units and across the program.
Great, thank you, Alvin. Can I just ask, would you say that the experience from the last year has helped us to move towards a more program-based assessment structure, or has it made harder because people have so much freedom and thinking about their own thing and doing what they want to do in their units, and we might have, because there was just so much to do, lost this kind of coordination aspect?
Well, I mean, in some ways, you know, but the conversation we had, I mean, in some ways it's made it easier, hasn't it? So, you know, it was always very difficult in terms of knowing what other people are teaching in the same year as you and what the students are learning on the program. It was pretty difficult to do that, you know, other than reading people's course documents, which aren't always very accurate and might be slightly outdated. It was always very difficult to go and do some teaching with them or step into their lecture for 10 minutes and just get a sense of the sort of level. And whereas now, with everything being recorded or even just live online lectures, potentially it's really easy now to just drop in or find out what people are doing. So in some ways, maybe we haven't we haven't sort of grasped the benefits of all of this online world yet, but potentially the coordination becomes easier, and maybe we just need to think about. And, you know, I know you're interested, Christian, in team teaching, and that's another thing that perhaps we haven't explored fully. You know, the online world should make coordination easier, and it should make team teaching easier.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alvin. Okay, so then the next group was, I think, with Ralph, thinking about MCQs, opportunities and limits of it.
Okay, so opportunities were clearly outlined that there are some learning outcomes, assessing them atomistically, as Alvin said, which can be assessed by multiple choice and then, or perhaps related computers, say computer-aided questions, and then that can be very convenient. It can work very well in encouraging students throughout the term if you use it as sort of continuous type assessments, whether it's summative or not. So there are certainly opportunities here, but we also highlighted that there are clearly some learning outcomes which are just too difficult to assess with MCQs, especially sort of skills which are at a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. It's just really challenging to write multiple choice questions, and you may just have to decide, okay, we can't do that. We need other methods. Now, one sort of useful thing someone pointed out is that a good activity to do is to ask students to think about multiple choice questions themselves. And that's perhaps one way to make them engage in higher level thinking, still with the activity of multiple choice questions. And there's actually sort of technology available, although I forgot the name, which facilitates that, students writing multiple choice questions and exposing them to other students, and sort of the questions being evaluated just as much as the answers by our students. And then we had a quite interesting part of the discussion was about time pressure in multiple choice exams, because we realized that often we use time pressure perhaps to differentiate at the top and say, okay, you only get the top, you know, marks if you answer the questions really quickly. You don't have to check your books, you know, to find that. And that was sort of one way of achieving differentiation at the top. There were sort of different views on whether that was justified, whether that is sort of, you know, a learning outcome that should be tested, whether you can answer quickly or not. But pointing out that, of course, if you do that, inclusivity has to be ensured. So there's students which have you know, any learning difficulties, they have to be accounted. Yeah.
That's great, Ralph. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about inclusivity because that's what we also started this session off, and I think it's this kind of, you have to be aware of this additional also admin workload there. I mean, it's fairly easy to do because if you have an online system, you can assign extra time to particular students, so that's possible. But I think that's something to keep in mind. Great. So the next group was Guglielmo. So is there any cheating? I think there were lots of questions also on the Padlet, so I might bring some of those in later on.
No, we all agreed unanimously that there is no cheating, that none of the students engage in cheating, and that is us not monitoring the students properly or not setting proper assessment. Now, I'm kidding. Some interesting examples of collaborations to the extreme or cheating was actually shared during the meeting. I think the discussion is, how do you go or how you cope with a context where, you don't have exams or assessment of students where students are all in one room and so on. And I think the starting point has been the workplace or the real world. In the workplace or in the real world, if students or if a worker is tasked with a particular job to do, then this person will have at disposal a lot of resources to produce whatever the person is asked to do. So the question is, can we do a similar kind of thing at university level where students have access to a number of various resources? But then what we do is we distinguish between the quality of their work in terms of the actual ability to analyze, interpret, show those kind of analytical higher order level of skills that we require. So the kind of open-endedness of assessment is seen as an important determinant. In the background, Turnitin is there as a kind of threat in terms of identifying students who might be colluding, and even if Turnitin not work in all possible contexts. We agree that probably collaboration is more likely to happen in year 2 and year 3, where year 1 students probably don't have yet the networks to do that kind of high level of collaboration, but also with the higher weight of year 2 and year 3, the incentive to try to collaborate and collude will increase. I think we all agree that these questions are actually pushing us towards designing better assessment, because we reflect more on what assessment we are giving to students, and we are promoting up assessment that helps students develop those kind of higher order skills that we wish to them to develop. And then finally, perhaps one issue that has gone missing in all this is that perhaps the narrative about open book assessment has gone lost. In other words, because of the pandemic, we have all been pushed into redesigning all our assessment in open book coursework, some other form, but we haven't taken the students with us in this journey. We haven't explained to them why we have done it and what is the purpose of it, and then what is the kind of relationship that students should have with this type of assessment. Instead, it looks as if students have just moved into a kind of utilitarian approach to say, oh, that's how it is. Oh, how can I game the system? And that's it. So perhaps there is some work we need to do in that respect.
That's great. Thanks so much, Guglielmo.
More or less it.
Brilliant. So there were quite a few comments around collusion and cheating also on the Padlet. If Ralph, maybe I just put that to Ralph, say that you discussed a bit on the Padlet about how one deals with collusion with open book exams. I'm not sure if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I gladly do. I think a lot, not all, but a lot of worries about cheating is in our head, and we can perhaps be a little bit more relaxed if we move the collaboration to the level where students have to think about methods rather than answers. So, and that, for instance, we talked about that in the multiple choice session. When you randomize multiple choice questions, and there's sort of, methods where you can randomize the numbers rather than the questions, then students can't share. Students will still collaborate, but they will not collaborate about is the answer 5 or 7, but they will collaborate about, okay, here my question is particular this, how do I solve it? And they may be working together to solve it together, or someone may get advice from someone else how to solve it. But that's really what we call learning together, right? So if we can move collaboration away from just sort of students being able to share final answers, then I think we've removed a little bit of the problem of sort of cheating and collaboration. But I have no illusions. We cannot eliminate this altogether unless we are going back to on-campus exam, and that's why I think we have to work hard to make sure that when students collaborate, it's at a level where we actually consider it more learning rather than cheating.
Yeah, and then I guess, Ralph, in many other disciplines, it kind of has been accepted for a very long time that some form of this collaboration is happening, right? Because other disciplines do assess more coursework heavy than we have been assessing in the past. So I always think it's also an interesting thing to think outside economics and other disciplines who have used many of the assessment methods, which we are now kind of leaning towards to, and they also have some experience with that, and maybe they think also some of this conversation is a positive one. There was maybe for Robert on the take-home exams for technical subjects, the randomization, it was mentioned. It is much easier with a quantitative courses, right? Because you can maybe change the functional form a little bit and have a slightly different question, different parameterization. What about more qualitative questions? Is there room for randomization, and how do you come up with a bank of similar questions?
I think that's a good question, because on the one hand, what I did in my statistics classes, I often used multiple choice questions with randomization to test more the technical bits, that you can solve your Lagrangian or your hypothesis test. And I would use in the final, let's say, takeaway exam or a coursework to test in more the discursive qualitative things. Do you know why this method is better than the other method? And I think, yeah, the only problem what I would see, if you have a qualitative method in and you want to randomize it, I think the marking could be very, very extensively if it cannot be just assessed by a computer system. I think that would be the worry what I would have, that if we randomize qualitative questions, that would be quite a lot of marking to do. But we can then do what John did, we just mark 1 out of 4, maybe. That would be a possibility.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks for that. There's one question on the Padlet around collaboration and cheating, and where's the line? And if people collaborate, can you rank them on the final output? So I know I don't know if I would put that back to Ralph, because I think you might have replied to that.
No, it wasn't me replying to that. I saw the reply, and indeed, I think we have to, but I said that in my answer before, I think we have to not consider every collaboration cheating, but we have to accept that it happens. Indeed, even encourage it, because in the world where we said earlier that it's a collaboration is an important skill to have, an important feature of real work life. So we can't. It's really difficult if at university we keep on telling students don't collaborate, don't cheat. We're not really giving the right messages here. But of course, and Fabio pointed that out, where when we're doing group work, we know students tend to hate aspects of that. But just because they hate it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing this.
Thanks, Ralph. So the last group was I think John and Mike, right? So do you just want to let us know what you have discussed? Feedback to big numbers.
Yeah. Okay. So we had a lot of discussion. So we were focusing on. I mean, we were supposed to be focusing on feedback with large groups, but we sort of ended up talking about other assessment issues, which were all really interesting. So we, as ever, as a group of academics, we never stuck to what we were supposed to. So first point, there was a bit of chat from, I think Adam contributed this idea of Portsmouth. They were giving out sort of a feedback immediately. So if you've got a large group module and you have some idea, or you can guess, you can forecast 80, 85, 90% of the common mistakes that you think students are going to make, you could produce that and get that out straight away, rather than waiting 3 weeks, 4 weeks till you've marked it all and then just produce basically the same information. And there was a little bit of discussion about that, which was quite interesting. Also, maybe just reading a group of them first and getting some ideas of what common weaknesses are and posting that. We then had a quick chat also about maybe speeding up the feedback process, and Monica was talking about her experience of using audio feedback and how maybe it's quicker. You can speak quicker than you can type, and also maybe some of the advantages of development feedback. So if your developmental feedback, I mean, we were joking about how on paper we can sound quite harsh, the developmental feedback, it can seem quite blunt. But somehow when it's done verbally, the intonation of your voice may make students more likely to respond and engage with that. So there was some pretty positive feedback on the use. I mean, there was an issue raised about uploading it, but obviously for UK people using Turnitin, there's an automatically uploaded audio feedback function in the feedback summary when you're marking. So what else did we do very, very quickly? So then we sort of digressed onto other things. So Lily went through a really interesting mix of using peer review. And I must admit, I want to come back to Lily at some point and get a more detailed outline, because it sounded really interesting about this sort of peer review on work. And Mike had also used sort of exemplars and found that really, really useful to get students to apply assessment criteria to exemplars as well. And then very, very quickly, Monica was just sharing her experiences. She sort of provided on people could submit before the deadline. I think if I've got this right, and Monica would provide some sort of feedback on that, effectively draft work, and to see if students would respond to that. And we had a quick chat about some of the pros and cons of responding to having students submit draft work. And I hope everybody, that's a. Have I left anything out? Anybody in the group? Mike, have I left anything out?
I think you covered it all. I think it's a broad sort of thing. I think in a way it was about being organised and be preemptive, kind of have a good sense of the feedback you think you're going to give before you need to start giving it in a way. So you can sort of sometimes correct the rights of past wrongs in a way. Great.
Excellent. Thanks both of you. So I've one last question to Fabio. There were a few comments around the Vivas. So do you use a pool of questions you think are equally difficult, or how do you adjust the questions also according to the quality of the answers you are getting? Can one be sure that this is kind of
I've done a few things this year. I moved from an individual big viva into a set of 4 vivas of increasing intensity. So we go from a viva, which is basically not a viva, because I ask a question in advance to students and just to get them used. Then the second viva, I post a list of questions that I might be asking, and the stake is a bit higher. So then I have a list of questions for myself, so they're going to be always the same, but that is not revealed to the students. And then in the final viva is really going to depend on what students written in their essay, and we discussed about that. So once again, the gist is going to be the same, the kind of questions are going to be the same, but of course they're going to be more tailored to what the students do. And in my opinion, it's a good compromise, sort of training the students to that. You know, I think that you need to accept some elements of individuality in each of the vivas that you deploy. It will be hypocritical for me to say that all the vivas are the same. They're really not. But students are aware of that and they accept it. I never had a problem with it.
And is there a maximum number of students you would think you could assess in that way?
Well, I was having a side conversation with people asking me this. I mean, as a rule of thumb, just know, it doesn't take me longer to process a viva, including giving feedback, than to mark an essay. So if in your module you got essays and you're marking essays, you can deploy vivas, and I will say it's cost neutral. It's not cheaper, but it's not more expensive. Now, I teach historioeconomic thought, which is quite a philosophical subject, most certainly in the way I teach it. It's a lot of philosophy of science. If you teach like an introductory module, probably you can do very short vivas as well. You know, it's like my viva, 15, 20 minutes. But I mean, there is a lot you can convey 5 minutes when you speak.
That's great. So the great thing about our Economics Network Symposia are that we always run a little bit over because there's just so much to talk, and it's so great to talk with so many people who care and who think about teaching. So I'll take that as a good sign. We are coming to the end, though. I'm sure this discussion will continue into the next year and further, and I hope we can kind of take the best bits out of our experience and continue sharing our insights, because I think that's how we can improve what we do in the whole sector. Thank you very much to everyone. I know Ashley wants to say something about the webpage, so I hand over to her for last comment, but thanks to everyone for taking the time and for discussing with us.